if we're starting from the beginning, like let's start. How you're familiar enough with Michael Flynn to educate?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so explain the context. What was he? How did he get pulled into this? What was he charged with, and what was he convicted of?
So Flynn was targeted originally. There's the government story. The government story was that they were looking into whether or not he violated the Logan Act, about whether or not he was representing the United States in an unauthorized way prior to his appointment as national security advisor. And that was the original pretext, that they went and interviewed him about matters related to it, that according to the government, he had lied to them. And that led to him being removed for his national security advisor because Sally Yates and other governmental officials went to Vice President Pence and then ultimately President Trump and said that accused General Flynn of lying to them and lying to the FBI. That led to the investigation. The investigation went broader than that. It looked at everything he had done in the last 30 years, basically. But ultimately, he originally pled guilty to one count of making a false statement to the FBI in that original interview about the subject of the Logan Act questions, which were whether he correctly recalled the conversation he'd had with the ambassador to Russia in that interview with the FBI agents.
Okay, and actually, the first interruption, the Logan Act is representing the United States in foreign affairs without authorization, give or take?
Yes, the Logan Act has never been used. It's back from 1799. It's never been used in the history of the United States to prosecute anyone ever. So that gives you an idea of how, as soon as I saw them referencing the Logan Act, my view was that this was simply absurd. That this was politically motivated, that it was likely pretextual and so forth, just because the Logan Act is never used. That's part one. Part two is the Logan Act actually does not preclude someone who is part of the transition team from having conversations with foreign leaders during the transition, which General Flynn was recognized as part of the national security team. So in that context, there was simply no legal base. There was nothing wrong with his conversation with the Russian ambassador. There was nothing illegal about it, even if the Logan Act was something that one could seriously look at, and it historically had never been that. And so between those two, that was reasons to second guess what was happening here. But that's what the Logan Act is. The Logan Act is mostly, it was originally on the books, a lot like the Emoluments Clause, which has also been misappropriated legally in the last couple of years. It was on the books because the concern was that a young government would have people go overseas, pretend to represent that young government, but not in fact have the authority to represent that young government. There's constitutional speech problems with the statute as applied. That's why the statute's never been applied, just like the Emoluments Clause has never been applied. The Emoluments Clause similarly was concerned with someone who was going to become an assistant diplomat, and once they became an assistant diplomat, they would use that power they would go over and they would be corrupted by, say, the Tsar of Russia or the Duke of France or the King of France. And he would say, "Hey, I'll give you a dukeship in exchange for if you see some black light going in and out, because there's a storm here in Tennessee." So everything that could go interesting has gone interesting of late. But putting that aside, it's truly not. Don't worry, anybody. It's not the CIA coming in. It's not someone coming to the side door. You might reasonably could be concerned with that these days, but I'm okay. But that's the nature of what's taken place. So they used the Logan Act as the excuse to get him. The argument against Flynn by the press and by the people who prosecuted him and punished or tried to punish him was, hey, look, he pled guilty to lying to an FBI agent. And Chris Wallace's argument on Fox News was, hey, that's a crime, period. Nobody should worry about the FBI using some quote unquote tough tactics. That's the institutional narrative on General Flynn. In my view, the more accurate narrative is that this was a case of entrapment. They went after him knowing he had no motivation to lie. He knew they had a transcription of the conversation they claimed he lied about. So why would he lie about that? He had no motivation to lie, no interest in lying, no incentive to lie. So this was a classic entrapment case where you get someone to do something they would not have otherwise done but for your inducement, which is to get them to fail to recall the exact nature of a conversation. You don't think it's consequential. You don't know it's a criminal case. You think these are buddies and pals of yours that are going to be working with you in the counterintelligence, counterespionage world. They don't tell you they're there to interview you for a criminal case. They don't even give you any warning. They don't even advise you it's a criminal case, despite Lisa Page advising them to try to sneak that in. And then their own FBI agents come back, write up notes that say, we don't think he lied to us, or if he, and even if he made inaccurate statements, we don't think he intended to make any inaccurate statement. Then they bury and hide those notes. They create doctored fake notes called 302s that are they're supposed to be the typed up version of the written notes. Instead, it's someone else typing up fake version of what took place in the written notes.
So and if we go back to do we know the nature of the lie for which he was convicted, or the lie to which he admitted? Like, what was the nature of that lie?
He didn't recall the precise scope of his conversation with the Russian ambassador and whether he had discussed certain subject matters in that conversation.
So his lie is, he says, I don't recall the scope. I don't remember what I said. I categorically did not discuss this when he categorically did, type thing?
It was more like, hey, did you discuss this issue? But you didn't discuss this issue, right? And he was like, yeah, I think that's right. I did discuss this and I didn't discuss that. So he's assuming they're telling him the accurate rendition of the conversation because they actually have the tape and the transcript. So that's how that conversation happens.
Okay.
But later on, when he's looking at it, he's like, maybe I just screwed up and got it wrong. So, they gaslit him into believing, I must have just got it wrong that day. And, okay, it's a false statement and they're going to come after my family. They're going to come after my son who just had a kid. They're going to attack everybody. I'll just plea and go home and forget, not go bankrupt continuing to fight this when he was already on the way to bankruptcy by fighting it that far.
So they get him on this inaccurate statement, press charges for lying. What is it? Not lying to Congress? Is it lying to the FBI?
Lying to the FBI, making a false statement to the FBI.
Okay. And he pleads guilty. What does he get sentenced to?
So his sentencing was scheduled to happen, and that's when all of this took a different course. So he shows up at sentencing. The judge hears the issues, and Judge Sullivan is well known. He's very idiosyncratic. Doesn't mean he's going to be a good criminal defense judge. It just means he's very idiosyncratic. Many years ago, Judge Sullivan presided over the case of Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, who was prosecuted there in the District of Columbia on corruption and bribery charges. He convicted Stevens. He sentenced Stevens. He was going to whack Stevens further. And all of a sudden, an FBI agent who was a whistleblower came forward and said, by the way, Judge, we actually fabricated and withheld a lot of key evidence. That so upset Judge Sullivan that he has instituted routine, broad orders on issues related to discovery. So when Flynn originally pleads, a different judge accepts the plea, a judge who's involved in the FISA warrants cases. Somewhere along the way, that judge realizes he has a conflict of interest and recuses himself. That case then gets assigned to Judge Sullivan. So when it's sentencing time, it's in front of Judge Sullivan. And Judge Sullivan expresses concern about two things. One, he sees evidence in the record and statements from General Flynn that suggest General Flynn may not have committed this crime, or at least doesn't believe he did. He's also concerned that General Flynn believes that he's been promised pure probation and that that's what he's going to get if he goes forward with the plea. So what the judge tells, he gives him the carrot and the stick. He tells General Flynn, I'm not going to sentence someone who believes they're innocent. And by the way, if you go forward, I'm going to treat this as a treason case and give you a harsh sentence. General Flynn's like, that was a total shock from what his lawyers had been telling him, the Covington law firm out of the District of Columbia, where very politically connected firm. Eric Holder is a partner at that firm, to give you an example, to give one example. And so he realizes he's got problems. He says, Judge, I need to wait on sentencing to re-examine issues with counsel, discovers that he's got issues with counsel, gets rid of that counsel, brings in Sidney Powell, who is a longstanding federal appellate counsel. And her perspective is, she wrote a book called License to Lie. And her perspective is that there's a lot of discovery abuse in the federal criminal process. I can tell you, without going into details about it, there was a point in time in which I may have become one of General Flynn's counsel. For a range of reasons, it was not a good fit. It wasn't good timing for me to get involved. But I did believe that his hiring Sidney Powell was a good idea and advised them of so. And I believe that if he went through a discovery research and review, he would find that, in fact, the government committed a lot of misconduct in this case, given my instinctual understanding and life experience in criminal defense and federal cases like this that are politically oriented or politically tainted. He does, and ultimately that leads to him demanding a bunch of discovery, and then he ultimately moves to withdraw his plea, and that motion is still pending before the court. And as part of his motions for discovery, the government and his former law firm suddenly discover they have a bunch of information that's helpful to his case that they've been withholding or had not produced before, including original notes and things like that.
Okay, so actually, I want to get there in a second. So Divinity says the judge asks for exculpatory evidence. Is that normal? It sounds like the judge was, I mean, maybe I'm projecting, hypothesizing, imagining. It sounds like the judge is twisting Flynn's arm, knowing that by threatening him with a more severe punishment than that for which he was prepared, he's going to get Flynn to retract his plea and expose this, or is that totally fabricated in my own head?
Nobody knows. So there was alternative interpretations of why Judge Sullivan did what he did. I can say as a general rule, ever since the Stevens case, Judge Sullivan has required broad, expansive discovery and made sure that prosecutors and agents complied with those discovery requests, even when they don't normally think that. They normally think in a plea case, they don't have to turn over any discovery. It's not really what the law is, but that's the norm. Judge Sullivan has said, I don't care what the norm is. You're going to turn over anything that could be helpful to the defense so that I don't get burned again like the Stevens case. So that's the background of why he did that.
Okay, so very interesting. And now, who turns over these notes? Where are these notes discovered? In the hands of Flynn's attorneys, or does the judge compel them from the prosecuting attorneys?
So what happened is the judge really hadn't compelled a lot of these yet. In fact, the judge had actually been, excuse me, the judge had actually been very skeptical and critical of prior efforts to get discovery. He was very critical of Sidney Powell even. So that led people to think, okay, maybe the judge is in serious individual new independent prosecutors to oversee all of these cases, Roger Stone and General Flynn, to review them for constitutional adequacy and accuracy in the discovery process. And it's after that point that it's the FBI and the Justice Department that produces these documents that had always been in the FBI's possession and custody that they just hadn't turned over. And somehow at the same time, the Covington law firm says, oh, we did a new search and we discovered all these other documents. My hunch is that the Covington firm was tipped off. The FBI was producing a bunch more stuff that might include documents that they had not turned over. And so they came up with this story, is my interpretation. Maybe totally legitimate. We'll find out in time. But so that's the correlation. The law firm finds out the FBI is producing information. So they suddenly say, oh, you know what? We do have a lot more records than we produced. We did the algorithm search wrong the first time.
So this is what I don't understand now. So Flynn there have been depositions already. Flynn has been charged. He's pled guilty. What round of depositions, what is the context of these depositions now that he's already pleaded guilty? This is for sentencing depositions?
So none of these are depositions technically. So what happened was when they did the interview, there's two different sets of notes that are relevant. One is the agent's set of notes when they did the original interview with Flynn. But the second separate one was their internal notes about their own internal meetings. And this is where Alex Jones Alex Jones has been critical of this, but where Scott Adams has had a lot of fun with this. So Scott Adams has been pointing out this has got to be the most comedic form of criminality in history, to sit there and take notes. Okay, I'm going to go over to General Flynn's house. Maybe I'll kick his dog or cat. Okay.
Yeah, I saw that. That was quite funny, actually.
Maybe I should burn these notes later? ?
And then there was a graphic of a male genitalia and General Flynn bent over.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so that was the equivalent of what these notes were. Now, they might have been taken by someone who did not like the attacks on General Flynn. So he was creating inculpatory records to impeach his fellow agents whose policies, whose prosecutorial decision-making he disagreed with. But either way, what these notes showed was that they had discussions about, one, there was no legitimate open investigation. It turned out that people had done a review of his 30-year history before this and had recommended the case be closed, that the agents kept it open arbitrarily, that they invented the Logan Act after the fact, that what the notes say is, what is our goal? Truth, admission, or just to get him to lie so we can get him fired or prosecuted? Well, that's literally, it's like an internal entrapment note. how do I get this person to commit a crime they would not have otherwise committed? The only purpose I'm even talking to them is to induce them to commit something that I could call a crime. And it's worse than the Marion Barry case. I mean, one of the interesting things is the defense that Chris Wallace on Fox News was making was, hey, he lied to the FBI, so it doesn't matter. Well, actually, it's never a defense on the government side to entrapment that the crime actually occurred. Entrapment, by definition, the crime actually occurred. So even if I have doubts, I don't believe he actually lied under oath. But even if you believe he did, if the government entrapped someone into lying when they had no otherwise motivation or incentive to lie, just like here, and it's never a defense to entrapment, like the Marion Barry case. They got him to use the crack cocaine by his mistress saying she's not going to sleep with him unless he does a hit of crack cocaine. They arrest him for the crack cocaine. It was all part of a setup by the FBI. Ultimately, that had to be thrown out because the question was, would he have done the crack cocaine but for the FBI creating the set of circumstances? The answer is no.
So two things. On the entrapment issue, entrapment is not a defense to the actual commission of the crime, but if the entrapment...
it is.
But if the entrapment reveals an ancillary crime, I presume then that nonetheless a conviction on the ancillary crime could be legitimate?
Entrapment is actually a defense to the crime. So you have an affirmative, it's considered an affirmative defense under United States criminal law. But if you can prove the government entrapped you, then that you're not guilty of the crime.
Okay, but that would be, hypothetically, that would be on the crime of lying. But let's just say, you wouldn't be found guilty on the crime of lying because you were entrapped. But if in the context of that investigation, they found tax evasion, the entrapment to the lying wouldn't be a defense to the actual tax evasion that they may have otherwise discovered.
Correct.
Okay, so when it comes to Flynn, first of all, I never even knew Marion Barry I never knew he was set up for the crack. I mean, I only knew the meme 20 years later, because we all know Marion Barry smoked crack, was the mayor that smoked crack. I never knew there was entrapment in there. But for Michael Flynn, he was only charged with lying as to his recollection of a specific conversation, and he pleaded guilty to that on the basis that he was not going to serve any time and get probation. He only gets in front of the sentencing judge, who is a substitute for whatever the reasons, and the sentencing judge says, I'm going to convict you for espionage based on what you did, unless you want to retract your plea, or not your plea, but sorry, your admission of, or whatever it is called. I guess it's a plea.
Yeah, in essence, what he tells him is, look, if you don't believe you're guilty, I'm not going to sentence you. But if you do believe you're guilty, then understand that I'm not bound by the plea agreement, and I see this crime as equivalent to treason. Now, the judge got some basic facts wrong in that comparison. He later sort of tried to walk that back after a media break in the case, and so just during the day. But the context of it led Flynn, I think, reasonably to presume that if he was going to go forward, he was not going to get a probationary sentence. And at that point, that was his only real reason to do it. It wasn't the probation; it was to make sure his son didn't get prosecuted and his son didn't get punished. But part of that was that he was not going to do actual prison time, and he could do several years inside. And so, given that, it was like, well, that doesn't make sense. When he knew down deep, he never believed that he was ever guilty. He had been gaslit into believing that he must have made a misstatement at the time of the interview. But he'd been gaslit into believing that, because down deep he was like, I had no motive to lie to anyone. Why would I lie to people who have the transcript of the file?
The argument will be he didn't know they had the transcript when they were asking him the question.
He did. He did. In fact, it came up during the conversation that they both admitted that they had the transcript of the conversation. Okay, well, he's like, you guys already know.
That's mildly relevant. Wash your hands says, didn't Flynn do time? Where has Flynn been kept in the meantime? Has he been liberated, or has he been in jail?
He's been out on bail, so he's never done any time at all.
Okay. So that's amazing. So in the conversation, they're saying you have the transcript of the call, but let me just test your memory on it, ask you some questions. He gives an I'm reluctant to use the word lie, even when it comes to adversarial examinations, but he gives an incorrect answer, which they then say this is a factually incorrect answer based on what we have of the transcript, which we knew that you had when we examined you. And then he says, okay, well, I plead guilty. I lied, probation, whatever, and I won't see a day in jail. Part of the plea bargain is you leave my kid alone. What would they have gone? What role does the kid have? Does his son have in all of this?
So there's two things about the plea involving his son. One is that that's not something you're supposed to do, the Department of Justice is supposed to do. So that's why they're not supposed to threaten prosecution against other people to get you to plea. Now, they do it frequently, but it's usually off the books. So they usually do it in such a way that it's not part of the formal plea agreement itself. That's what happened here. They also tried to deny it, and then there were internal emails and documents that proved what General Flynn was saying all the time. Because there was a period of time in which the people anti-Flynn were saying, oh, Flynn's just making this up. This had nothing to do with why he pled. Well, now the internal documents from his law firm, now the internal documents from the Justice Department prove, yes, they in fact were threatening his son with prosecution unless he pled. The issue with his son was both he and his son were put under intensive investigation, microscopic investigation for everything they'd done in their whole lives. And in that context, for several years after General Flynn left office when he worked for Obama, between 2014 until he was working with President Trump in 2016, during that 2-year time period before President Trump was elected, he had represented various governments in making arguments about public policy issues before the various public officials in the U.S. government. And that was the only time period he's ever done it in his life. The law firm that was working for him during that time frame was the same one that was supposed to be defending him in the criminal case, when it turned out they had a conflict of interest because they may not have properly handled all the paperwork because both he and his son were part of that. The interesting thing about all of that is it's under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. There's only been 6 criminal prosecutions in American history under that law. And so it can be broadly and unconstitutionally interpreted. Nobody knows exactly what it means and how it applies. It's intended for a limited scope of circumstances, but they've applied it to a much broader. To give an example, General Flynn was not hired directly by any foreign government, but he disclosed that the source of the funds were connected to that foreign government, Turkey, anyway. So they knew what he was doing. He disclosed what he was doing. The only issue became, did he and his son get everything right on the paperwork? They couldn't find that he did anything wrong. So they said, you know what, we're going to look at your son and we're going to try to find something that your son did that we can say is a criminal law violation. And his law firm, unbeknownst to him, had a conflict of interest because they would be implicated in any mistakes related to it, already had been, gave him bad advice in that capacity. And the case that was ultimately prosecuted in Virginia was so bad, the judge ultimately dismissed the charges in the case related to other people that were part of this, not Flynn and his son, but other people that were connected to Flynn and his son related to lobbying on behalf of the Turkish government. And so it turned out like he was never a unregistered foreign agent. He was never a foreign agent, really. He was someone who represented political groups who had connections to a foreign government, who, if that's a crime, 80% of Washington can be put in prison tomorrow because that's the nature of their currency, of their political power and economic influence and economic self-enrichment is some way, shape, or form aiding a foreign government, usually the Middle East, sometimes or China or other countries or Europe, as the case may be. So it was a highly unusual prosecution. But if you're Michael Flynn, you've never been through the criminal process before, your law firm is telling you you have no choice but to do a plea or your family may suffer badly. The government's saying, don't worry, if you do this, nobody's going to suffer any bad consequences ever again. The government's telling you and gaslighting you into believing something happened that didn't happen in the conversation in terms of what you intended, hiding the notes that say their own agent said, hey, he didn't intentionally lie to us at all. And throughout that entire process, you're going through a process you've never experienced before. He's never been through the federal or state criminal process of any kind. It sounds scary. It sounds terrifying. Mueller's going after everybody, everyone, and everywhere, including anyone connected to General Flynn. I was contacted by people that simply had an affiliation or association with General Flynn that Mueller was trying to target and harass. And these were high-ranking, well-regarded military and law enforcement officials in our government. So they used Flynn to take out all of the potential allies, all the potential white hats that could have protected Trump. It was part of a political campaign, in my view. Now we have a lot of evidence to back that up. It was more interpretive when I originally suggested it, but now there's more evidence behind it. But that's basically what happened. It was an extraordinary case of government entrapment over the most exaggerated set of charges ever witnessed, using every coercive tactic known to man, benefiting from conflicted counsel in the process that they almost all got away with, but for one judge having to recuse himself and another judge having been burned before by government corruption.
Amazing. And now Rebecca Gallant says, I'm praying he sues the hell out of the government. Would this be one of the cases that's getting close to malicious prosecution or no?
It's almost impossible to sue a United States attorney. Almost impossible to sue the FBI. So even if they had no probable cause, and that they clearly in their own internal notes had no probable cause to instigate the investigation in the first instance, the law is so tough that it's very rare that you can bring a malicious prosecution case in the United States, even rarer that you can win them. My guess is that won't be his inclination. His inclination will be to seek public vindication and re-participate in the political process with that public vindication.
Okay, and I'm just going to read one joke from the Real Bambuga. It says, is anybody else having trouble believing the Right Honorable FBI of J. Edgar Hoover would ever do something dishonest? So, okay, I mean, if you have to, in a sentence, because what I said is like, this is sort of my understanding of what had happened. I'm shocked, I'm appalled. I sort of know enough to know why it's so shocking and appalling. If you summarize it, and I'm going to timestamp this for my excerpt from the highlight I'll post tomorrow. If you summarize it in one sentence, or let's say 2 paragraphs, why is this so shocking, and what is it about this that is so shocking that every God-fearing citizen, let alone American citizen, should be outraged by what they've witnessed or what they know of now?
If the highest ranks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice can do this to someone like General Flynn, imagine what they're doing to ordinary people and getting away with doing to ordinary people all around the country. That's the shocking and unsettling thing, because here was a guy who was supposed to have a sophisticated defense. Here was a guy who was one of the most well-regarded military officials in the country. Here's a guy with no record of any problems or questions or controversy in his entire military career. Here's a guy who is the #1 national security advisor to the newly elected president of the United States. If he could be taken out so effectively, so quickly, not only from political power, but from any degree of political public reputation or prominence, and then criminally prosecuted and railroaded into possible prison time, then you can imagine what they're doing to everyday people. And when the only thing he did wrong was trust FBI agents were being honest with him when they sat down to do a casual interview that they said was part of his job, not for an independent investigation. I'll be getting some people that will push back and say, oh, well, if the FBI knocked on my doors, I'd pay attention to what I said. But the FBI walked into General Flynn's office every day when he was a national security advisor, because they're working with him in the counterintelligence, counterespionage units of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice. That's part of their job, is to coordinate to see who's doing what, who's saying what, so on and so forth. That's why he knew they had recorded him. That's why he talks about the fact they had recorded him. And so he's just thinking, hey, they're probably just asking for something rather than going back and reading the transcript. They want a quick version, and they already know what they remember, and they're just checking with me. And he's not thinking it's anything formal, anything full, anything the rest. So if they could set out to get someone like him, and these were people that were at the head of their departments, these were at the head of the most politically sensitive departments in the country, then you can imagine what, if some ordinary FBI agent in your local neighborhood decides he doesn't like you, imagine what he can do to you if what they did to Flynn is what happened to Flynn is what can happen to you. And that, I think, is the terrifying aspects of this case.